The overdue electricity bill lay next to an unpurchased prescription on the old kitchen counter. Two thin sheets of paper, one warning that my house was about to be plunged into darkness, the other reminding me that my body was also reaching its limit. I picked them up countless times this past week and put them back down, as if just looking at them long enough would make the numbers disappear. My name is Henry, and I'm 62 years old. There was a time when I owned a small printing press and believed that hard work would ensure my family never had to worry about money. 12 years later, I sit in my own kitchen, counting every penny to save on electricity for another month, and wondering whether I should buy my medicine or pay the bill first. Outside, the late-day Texas heat still sweltered. The old air conditioner hummed weakly, trying to push the last of its cool air into the kitchen before the power company cut off the electricity. The house was so quiet, I could hear the ticking of the wall clock and the hoarse cough coming from my own chest. Each cough made my chest ache, as if someone were squeezing my heart from the inside. I opened my old wallet, $28 in cash, a few loose coins, and a credit card that had reached its limit. I calculated it over and over again, but I couldn't turn $28 into nearly $500 to cover another month's electricity bill, nor could I turn it into nearly $300 to buy the medicine the doctor prescribed. At this age, I no longer fear poverty. I only fear that one day I will collapse without having finished what I left unfinished. Martha's laughter rang out from the living room, interrupting my thoughts. Martha is my wife, the woman who has been with me for over 30 years of marriage. We built everything from scratch, lived in a cramped rented apartment, and promised to grow old together, no matter what life threw at us. But in recent years, I've had the feeling she no longer sees me as the man who once stood by her through difficult times. For Martha, the family's success is now tied to just one name, Victor. Martha walked into the kitchen with the phone pressed to her ear, a glass of white wine in her other hand. She barely noticed me sitting at the dining table. All her attention was on the call. I only overheard a few sentences, but each word was clear enough to piece together a complete picture. Victor had just completed a $20 million company merger. Victor is my eldest son. He used to be the greatest pride of my life. I spent almost all the money I earned from the printing press on his education at the best business school, hoping that one day he would have a life I never had. And indeed, he has succeeded far beyond my expectations. It's a pity that, on his path to the top, he seems to have left his father behind as well. Martha smiled incessantly. She kept congratulating her son, asking about the celebratory party on the yacht this weekend, inquiring about which investors would be attending, and saying that she had never doubted his abilities. It had been a long time since I'd seen her face so radiant. What bittered me wasn't Victor's success. As a father, I always hoped for that. What choked me up was the gap between my son's life and the life of the man who gave birth to him, a gap now so large that it couldn't be measured in money anymore. One side was discussing $20 million. The other side was worrying about $486 to avoid having their electricity cut off. The call ended after almost 10 minutes. Martha put the phone down, took another sip of wine, and still maintained her smile. I silently pushed the bill towards her. It wasn't because I wanted money, but because it was the bill for this house, where we're both still living. Martha just glanced at it and pushed the paper back towards me with her fingertips. "Deal with it yourself." Her voice was chillingly calm, as if what lay before her was just a misdelivered advertisement. I explained that I was short on money because the company had cut my shifts, that I just needed a few $100s to get through the month. Martha didn't ask how much money I had left, nor why the prescription was still sitting on the table. She just shrugged and said it wasn't her business. I glanced at the prescription. The edges were curled up from days in my coat pocket. The doctor said my cough wasn't normal, told me to buy the medicine immediately, and come back for a checkup if the chest pain continued. I'd been to the pharmacy twice, and returned empty-handed. Each time the pharmacist read out the amount, I just smiled, made up an excuse about forgetting my wallet, and walked out. That feeling of helplessness was harder to swallow than the cough that had lasted for weeks. Martha saw the prescription too, but she didn't ask what the doctor's diagnosis was. Her only concern was that Victor was having a perfect weekend, and no one was allowed to disturb him. She said if I needed money, I should find another way. If I was really desperate, I could ask Elena. I looked up at her for a long time. Elena is my youngest daughter. Unlike her brother, she chose to become a nurse at the city hospital. Her salary barely covers rent, student loans, and daily living expenses. She had no mansion, no yacht, no million-dollar deals. The only thing Elena always had was the time to call and ask if I'd had dinner, and the patience to listen whenever I said I was okay, even though we both knew it wasn't true. Elena was the least wealthy in the family, yet Martha wanted me to reach her first, instead of her son, who had just made $20 million in a single deal. At that moment, I understood the problem had never been money. If Victor were still as poor as he was 10 years ago, Martha would have found another reason to stop me from calling him. What she wanted to protect wasn't her son's bank account. What she wanted to protect was his image of success, even if the price was her husband sitting in a kitchen, about to have the power cut off, with a prescription they couldn't afford. Martha picked up the phone and walked out of the kitchen. Before going upstairs, she turned back just once and reminded me not to park the power company's truck in front of the house, because the neighbors would see. That was the last thing she said to me that night. Not to ask if I'd eaten, not to ask if my cough was better, just the worry of what others would think. The kitchen fell silent again. I opened my old wallet once more, as if hoping for a miracle. Still $28, a few coins, and the faded family photo. In that photo, Victor still had his arm around Elena, and Martha still rested her head on my shoulder. Back then, I believed that if I ever fell, the people in that photo would be the first to run to catch me. I don't know when I was wrong. I only know that that night, when the coughing returned and a small blood stain appeared on my palm, the first person that came to mind wasn't Victor nor Martha. That's Elena. I wasn't always the man who had to sit and count every penny of the electricity bill. 12 years ago, every morning, I was the first one to open the printing shop. The smell of fresh ink, the sound of the offset press starting up, and the noise of trucks coming and going had been a part of my life for almost 20 years. I wasn't rich, but the work was enough to support the whole family, pay the mortgage on this house, and send Victor to the business school he'd always dreamed of. I still remember the day. Victor received his acceptance letter. He hugged me, and Martha cried with happiness. That day, I told my son not to worry about tuition. I would take care of everything. Just study hard and have a better life than his father. That's a promise I've never regretted. What I regret is believing in an investment that I thought would help the family take another step forward. The warehouse was located on the southern edge of the city. It wasn't new, but the location was excellent, close to a major freight route. A friend in the industry recommended it to me, saying that with some renovation, it would become the perfect transit hub for growing logistics companies. I poured almost all my savings into it. I even mortgaged my house. At the time, Martha didn't object. Victor didn't object either. On the contrary, they were both very enthusiastic. Victor even said that if the deal went through, he would have the capital to start his own company after graduation. I believed I was building a new ladder for my family. I didn't know I was stepping straight into a pit. 3 months after the purchase was finalized, vehicles from the Environmental Protection Agency appeared at the warehouse gate. At first, I thought it was just a routine inspection. But that afternoon, they started erecting fences, putting up warning signs, and ordering all employees to leave the area. An environmental engineer pulled me aside and whispered. They discovered traces of toxic industrial waste buried underground for many years. I stood there speechless. I didn't know. He looked at me sympathetically. I believe you. But that won't change the situation. In less than a week, the entire warehouse was sealed indefinitely. The bank froze the loan, customers canceled contracts, lawyers called constantly. Local newspapers ran headlines large enough for anyone passing by the newsstand to see. To them, I was no longer the owner of the Henry Walker printing press. I was the man who owned the contaminated land. Then came the longest months of my life. I sold the printing press. I sold my new pickup truck. I sold almost all the equipment to pay off the debt. But that still wasn't enough. At 50, when many people are starting to think about retirement, I was applying for jobs like a fresh graduate. No one cared about my past business ownership or how many jobs I had created. All they saw was a bankrupt man. Eventually, I got a job driving a forklift in a warehouse about 40 miles from home. My shift started at 5 in the morning. Every day I left home while it was still dark and returned after sunset. My clothes always smelled of diesel fuel, paper dust, and sweat. My hands were covered in new calluses on top of old ones. Some nights, I was so tired I fell asleep on the sofa without even taking off my shoes, but I never complained. I just thought that if I worked long enough, paid off the debt, things would gradually go back to normal. I was wrong. The debt gradually decreased, but the respect within my own home also decreased. Victor was the first to change. At first, he just spoke less. Then, every time the warehouse was mentioned, his voice was laced with frustration. And gradually, every argument in the house ended with the same sentence. If Dad hadn't invested in that damn piece of land, things would have been different. The first time I heard that, I didn't respond. I thought he was just angry. But then that sentence repeated itself for years to the point where it became a reality in Victor's mind. To him, I was no longer the father who had given him the opportunity to study. I was the one who had taken away his chance at wealth. One evening, after Victor graduated from university, he put his job application down on the table and looked straight at me. If you hadn't gone bankrupt, I would have had the capital to start my own company. Now I have to work for someone else. I looked at him for a long time. I'm working for someone else too. That was your choice. I said nothing more. Because I realized that explanation was pointless. There are people who, once they've decided who the culprit is in their lives, no longer want to hear any other truth. What hurt me even more was that Martha didn't say a word. She just sat there silently. That silence was like a vote in Victor's favor. Since then, every time something displeased him, Victor would bring up the warehouse. He'd talk about the money lost, the missed opportunities, and the future he believed should have been his. He never once asked me how many hours I'd worked to pay off those debts. He never once asked how much my shoulders ached after 12 hours of driving the forklift. He only saw what he'd lost. He never saw what I'd tried to hold on to. That night, after Martha told me to deal with the electricity bill myself, I sat alone in the kitchen, and memories of 12 years ago flooded back. I suddenly understood that the bill in front of me wasn't the beginning of the tragedy. It was just the final bill in a chain of mistakes that began the day the warehouse was locked with a yellow chain and a red sign that read, "Celed Area." That day, I lost possessions, but years later, I realized I had lost even more valuable things. After the night I saw the first bloodstain on my palm, I still tried to convince myself that things weren't that serious. I continued going to work, continued driving the forklift from dawn until dusk. Each time the pain came, I would stop for a few minutes, take a sip of water, and tell myself I could still bear it. I fooled so many people. It's a pity I couldn't fool my own heart. That morning, while lifting a heavy stack of paper onto a shelf, a sudden, intense pain gripped my chest. Everything went dark, my legs gave way. I heard someone call my name, then the sound of a forklift braking sharply, and then everything plunged into a thick darkness. When I opened my eyes, I was in the emergency room of the district hospital. The stark white ceiling, the pungent smell of disinfectant, and the steady hum of the heart monitor beside me made me realize that this time it wasn't as simple as the previous pains. A cardiologist pulled up a chair beside my bed and placed a stack of medical records in front of me. He didn't try to comfort me or beat around the bush. After years in the profession, he probably understood that people my age just needed to know the truth. The angiography results showed a severely narrowed coronary artery. Without a stent placed as soon as possible, the risk of a heart attack is very high. The hospital can schedule the surgery in the next few days, but before that, I have to complete the $8,000 deposit. I stared at the bill for a long time. The number left my mind blank. Just a few days ago, I was standing at the pharmacy counter, unable to afford a $300 prescription. Now, they're asking for $8,000 to save my life. I opened my old wallet on the bedside table. $28 was still in the cash drawer, next to a few coins and an old family photo. The gap between $28 and $8,000 was so large that I didn't know where to begin. I sat silently in the hospital room for almost half an hour before picking up the phone. The first person I called was Martha, not to ask for money. Even though there was so much distance between us, she was still my wife. I thought she should at least know her husband was in the hospital and might be undergoing heart surgery. The call connected fairly quickly. I briefly explained my condition, recounted what the doctor had said, and mentioned the upcoming surgery. There was a moment of silence on the other end. Then, Martha asked just one question. How much will it cost? When I mentioned the $8,000 deposit, her voice immediately dropped. No more questions about my health, no more offers to come to the hospital. She simply said she didn't have that much money, and that Victor was busy preparing for a celebratory party after a big deal, and it was best not to disturb him at this time. The call ended very quickly. Martha didn't even ask which room I was in. I put down the phone and looked out the window at the afternoon sun shining on the hospital parking lot. For the first time in years, I felt I was no longer a priority for the woman who had promised to hold my hand until the end of my life. But I still hadn't given up. If there was anyone in the world capable of helping me get through this, it could only be Victor. I dialed my son's number. The phone rang for quite a while before connecting. As soon as the call opened, loud music and laughter filled the speaker. I could picture Victor standing in the middle of a lavish party, holding an expensive glass of wine, surrounded by people congratulating him on his success. I explained my situation and stated frankly that the hospital required an $8,000 deposit before proceeding with the surgery. There was a few seconds of silence on the other end. I had hoped just one sentence, "Let me handle it." But what I received was completely different. Victor said that he couldn't continue to bear the consequences of my decisions. According to him, if the hospital believed I could still pay, they would allow installments. If even the hospital doesn't believe it, then there's no reason for him to invest money, knowing he won't get it back. Every word was calm. No shouting, no anger. It was that very calmness that hurt my heart more than the illness I was suffering from. Before hanging up, Victor only left one short sentence. He didn't want to continue throwing money into a bottomless pit. The phone screen went black. I held it in my hand for a long time. In that moment, I suddenly remembered Elena. She would rush over if she knew I was lying here. I knew that, but precisely because I knew, I couldn't call. Elena is just a nurse whose salary barely covers rent and student loans. She also works night shifts to supplement her income. I can't burden the least financially secure child with a responsibility the wealthiest has just refused. I opened my contacts. Elena's name appeared right below Victor's. My finger lingered on the screen for a long time. Finally, I locked the phone and put it down. If fate has decided this is my end, I will accept it. At least I don't want to drag her into a debt she shouldn't have to bear. I reached for the hospital bill again. The words, "Daples due." $8,000 remained silently at the bottom of the page, like a predetermined verdict. Just as I was thinking about signing the discharge papers to go home, the phone on the bedside table suddenly rang. The screen lit up. The caller's name appeared, Elena. The phone rang, and I saw Elena's name on the screen. In that instant, my first reaction wasn't relief, but worry. I knew she'd sensed something was wrong just from hearing my voice. So, I took a deep breath before answering, but even a few short sentences were enough for Elena to understand I was in the hospital. Less than an hour later, the hospital room door opened. Elena was still wearing her light blue nurse's uniform, her hair hastily tied back, and her everyday work backpack slung over her shoulder. Her breathing was labored, and beads of sweat on her forehead showed she'd practically run from the parking lot. She didn't ask why I'd hidden myself. She just walked to the bedside, took my hand, and silently gazed at me for a long time. It was a look I'd been familiar with since Elena was little. Every time I had a fever or got injured at work, she'd look at me like that. No reproach, no panic, just quiet observation to make sure I was still there. The doctor returned a few minutes later. Elena asked to hear the full test results again. She carefully read each number on the angiography, asking detailed questions about the degree of arterial narrowing and the risks of further delay. Finally, the doctor closed the file and repeated what I had heard many times that day. The surgery wasn't too complicated, but the hospital needed an $8,000 deposit before proceeding. I saw Elena nod slightly. Her face barely changed, but I noticed her fingertips were gripping the edge of the file so tightly that they were turning white. After the doctor left, the room fell silent again. The late afternoon sunlight streamed through the window, casting long shadows of father and daughter on the cold tile floor. I told Elena that I would ask to be discharged. Not because I didn't want to live, but because I couldn't afford the money. I also made it clear that she wasn't allowed to borrow or sell anything because of me. Elena didn't argue. She just sat quietly, listened to everything I said, and gently nodded. That very calmness made me uneasy. I knew my daughter better than anyone. From childhood to adulthood, whenever Elena made a decision, she never argued. She just did it silently. The next morning, Elena still went to the hospital before her shift. She brought a cup of hot coffee and some homemade porridge. We talked very little. Mostly, Elena asked the doctor questions, checked her medication schedule, and then hurried back to the hospital where she worked. In the evening, after her shift ended, Elena returned home. This cycle repeated for 3 consecutive days. During those 3 days, Martha didn't show up, neither did Victor. The phone on the bedside table hardly rang again, except for a few calls from the insurance company and my workplace. The manager only inquired about my health and told me not to think about work yet. The house I had spent my whole life preserving seemed to be functioning normally, only lacking the man lying in this hospital room. On Wednesday morning, Elena entered the room with a carefully folded brown envelope. She placed it on the small table next to the bed and gently pushed it towards me. The envelope was quite thick, tied with an old rubber band. I opened it. Inside were stacks of cash, still sealed with the bank's paper envelopes. I counted very slowly. $8,000. Not a penny missing. I looked up at Elena. She was still standing by the window, her hands clasped in front of her stomach, like a child waiting to be scolded by her parents. Just by looking at her face, I knew this money hadn't come easily. It took Elena a long time to tell me the truth. The first $5,000 was all the money she had saved over many years to enroll in a nursing program. It was a dream Elena always mentioned whenever we talked. She wanted to continue her studies so that she could qualify as a head nurse and open a small clinic for the elderly. The rest was borrowed from a private finance company at an interest rate of 22% per year. Just hearing that number made my chest feel heavy. I knew how terrifying those kinds of loans were. They could devour years of a person's labor in just a few months, but what left me speechless was what came next. To qualify for the loan, Elena sold the camera I'd given her for her 25th birthday. I still remember the day I bought it. I had to work overtime for almost 4 months straight to afford it. Elena carried it all the way home, so carefully that even when it rained, she wouldn't let the box touch the ground. On every rare vacation, she'd bring the camera with her, saying she wanted to travel across America to document all the places she'd been. That camera wasn't just an object, it was Elena's dream. And now, that dream had been exchanged for an envelope of cash lying before me. I asked her if she regretted it. Elena shook her head slightly and looked at me with a very calm expression. She said she could buy the camera again any time if she worked hard for a few more years. But if I lost my father, no store in the world could ever sell me a second father. I turned my face towards the window. It was the first time in many years that I couldn't hold back my tears. I had lost the printing press. I had lost the warehouse. I had lost my honor, my job, and almost everything I had built. But no loss had hurt me as much as realizing that the poorest child in the family was the only one willing to sacrifice their future to keep me alive. That afternoon, I signed the consent form for the surgery. Not because I was no longer afraid, but because for the first time in many years, I understood that I was no longer allowed to give up. Not for myself, but because there was someone who had put their dreams on the line just to give my heart a chance to continue beating. The surgery took place early the next morning. As I was wheeled into the operating room, the last thing I saw was Elena standing at the end of the hallway in her blue protective suit. She wasn't allowed into the sterile area, so she could only stand at a distance. Before the operating room door closed, Elena gave a thumbs up as if to say everything would be all right. I nodded in return, and then the ceiling lights dimmed as the anesthesia began to take effect. The next time I opened my eyes, everything was quieter than I expected. The pain in my chest was still there, but it was different. It was no longer the suffocating feeling I had before, just a dull ache around the incision. The heart monitor continued its steady hum beside me, but for the first time in months, I could take a deep breath without stopping mid-air because of the pain. The doctor said the stent placement was more successful than expected. If I followed the treatment and changed my lifestyle, I still had many years ahead of me. I thanked him, but my mind was only on one person. Without Elena, those words would never have had a chance to be spoken. After being discharged from the hospital, I didn't return to my own home. Elena insisted on taking me to the small apartment she rented near the hospital. It was a one-bedroom apartment with a combined living room and kitchen, and a balcony just big enough for a few small potted plants. Elena gave me the bedroom, and she spread a thin mattress on the living room floor. No matter how much I objected, she stuck to her decision. The first few days of recovery dragged on slowly. Every morning, Elena would get up at 5 o'clock, prepare breakfast and medicine, and then go to work. Before leaving the house, she would always stick a small note on the refrigerator door, clearly stating the time to take her medicine, the time to go for her walk, and the foods I absolutely must not touch. In the evening, even after working 12 hours straight, Elena still took the time to cook, check my blood pressure, and chat with me until late at night. I started noticing a few changes. The camera Elena always kept on her bookshelf was gone. Every morning, instead of driving her old hatchback to the hospital as before, she'd put on her sneakers and walk out of the apartment. The hospital was almost 40 minutes away on foot. I asked where the car was, and Elena just laughed and said she'd left it with a friend because parking fees had gone up. I knew she was lying, but I also knew I wouldn't get any more information. 16 days after the surgery, just as I finished my first cup of coffee of the day, the phone suddenly rang. It was an unknown number. The caller introduced himself as a lawyer for the Environmental Protection Agency. At first, I thought they were calling about some leftover paperwork related to the old warehouse. I even braced myself for more bad news, but it turned out to be completely the opposite. The lawyer announced that after years of processing and reassessing the entire area, the authorities had officially lifted the seal. All accumulated industrial waste from the previous owner had been processed. The land was eligible for commercial exploitation, and my legal ownership had been fully restored. I sat there speechless. 12 years. For 12 years, I had waited for a call like this. I thought that upon hearing this news, I would be overjoyed beyond words. But the first thing that came to my mind was a feeling of emptiness. If that call had come a few years earlier, perhaps I wouldn't have had to sell the printing factory. Perhaps I could have saved my marriage. Perhaps Victor wouldn't have looked at me as a failure. But life never gives back lost years to anyone. I had barely hung up the phone when, less than an hour later, another call came. This time it was from a real estate and logistics development company. The representative spoke very briefly. Newly completed highway had made the entire area around the warehouse a strategic location for a large-scale goods distribution center. After months of surveying, their corporation wanted to buy the entire plot of land with cash. The initial offer was $25 million. I thought I misheard. I asked the man on the other end to repeat the number once more. He read slowly. $25 million. Cash, if I agreed, they could complete the deal in less than 3 weeks. I sat motionless for a long time after the call ended. On the small table in front of me was still the steaming cup of coffee Elena had just brewed. Next to it were the box of heart medication, the appointment booklet, and the reminder for her medication that she pasted on the card every morning, $25 million. That amount was enough to change anyone's life. But what bothered me most wasn't the money. It was the first name that would come up if Martha and Victor found out. I looked out the window. Elena was walking home from the hospital after her shift. Her old backpack was still on her shoulder, her steps weary but steady. She had no idea that just minutes before, both her and her father's lives had taken a new turn. I folded the piece of paper with the real estate company's phone number, carefully put it in the drawer, and locked it. It was the first secret I'd decided to keep to myself in so many years, not because I wanted revenge, but because, for the first time, I wanted to make sure that those who only remembered me when I had money wouldn't have a chance to appear before those who stayed when I had nothing. I didn't call the real estate company that day. The piece of paper with their phone number was still in Elena's dining table drawer, right under the box of heart medication. Every time I took out my medicine, I saw it. $25 million was just centimeters away, but I left it there for 3 days. Not because I doubted the offer. I doubted myself. After 12 years of living in debt, it's hard to believe that luck still remembers your name. I was afraid it was all a mistake. I was afraid I would hope again, only to be disappointed again. Like the day the warehouse was sealed. On the 4th day, I arranged to meet my old lawyer. His name was Richard. We knew each other from when I ran the printing press. His hair was almost completely gray, but his work ethic was still as meticulous as ever. After hearing my story, Richard didn't say anything immediately. He simply asked me to leave all the documents related to the land, then quietly opened each file that had been gathering dust for over 10 years. The inspection lasted nearly 3 hours. Sales records, bank loan records, security records, decisions from the environmental agency, and finally, a stack of documents yellowed at the corners. Richard stopped. He took off his glasses, wiped them very slowly, and looked at me. "I think you should reread this." I took the file. On the very first page was a sentence I had almost forgotten. Asset division agreement after the financial crisis. I remember very clearly the moment I signed that document. It was 5 years ago. At that time, creditors were still constantly sending letters to the house. Victor had just started building his own company. Martha was increasingly worried that my debts would affect the remaining family assets. It was Victor who found the lawyer. It said the division of assets was merely a precautionary measure, so that, if the creditors ever returned, the house and property registered in Martha's name wouldn't be affected. At the time, I didn't object. I even felt relieved. If signing a few papers could keep my wife and children safer, I was willing to do it. Richard flipped to the last clause and lightly tapped a paragraph with his finger. "I want you to read this carefully." I leaned down. The text wasn't long, but it only took a few seconds to make me freeze. According to the agreement, Martha voluntarily relinquishes all current and future rights to the sealed warehouse, regardless of any future changes in the value of the property. I read it a second time, then a third time. Not a word was missing. Richard leaned back in his chair. This clause remains in effect. That means if the land is sold today, all the money belongs to you. I remained silent. That property is no longer the joint property of the couple. I still said nothing. Richard pulled the file closer. This very document separated the land from the joint property 5 years ago. Why didn't I notice then? He looked at me for a long time, then smiled sadly. Because at that time, the land was worthless. That's right. When that document was signed, no one thought the land could be revived. In everyone's eyes, it was just a dead piece of land. A burden, a mistake of mine. Martha wanted to leave it behind. Victor wanted to be even quicker. What they tried to discard to protect themselves back then has now become the most valuable asset I've ever owned. Richard took another file from the drawer. It was a copy of the new land registry certificate updated after the seal was lifted. Owner only one name, Henry Walker, no Martha, no Victor, just me. I held the paper for a long time. 12 years ago, I thought the land had taken everything from me. Now, that same land was about to give me back more than I had ever lost. Leaving the lawyer's office, I didn't go straight to Elena's apartment. I drove past the old house. Martha's car was still parked in the yard. On the lawn in front of the house was the advertising sign for the gardening company that Victor regularly hired for his mother. Through the window, I saw Martha sitting in the living room, a new tablet in her hand. She had no idea that just miles away, an agreement she herself had signed 5 years earlier had changed our lives completely. I didn't get out of the car. I didn't knock either. I drove away quietly. That evening, Elena returned from her shift with her usual exhaustion. She placed her shoes by the door, gently rubbed her calves, and went into the kitchen to prepare dinner. While cooking, Elena casually talked about an elderly patient who had just been discharged and laughed as she mentioned she had almost burned the soup because she was so busy. I sat and watched her for a long time. She still didn't know anything. I wasn't going to tell her yet, at least not now. I wanted all the procedures completed before anyone else knew about the existence of the $25 million. I was all too familiar with how people change when money comes into play. This time, I wanted to be prepared, not for revenge, but to ensure that the money would never fall into the hands of those who would only remember me when I was no longer poor. 3 weeks later, the land transfer contract was finalized. Everything went faster than I expected. The logistics company transferred the full amount as promised. When lawyer Richard gave me the final transaction confirmation, I stared at the numbers on the computer screen for a long time. $25 million was now in my account. 12 years ago, that very piece of land cost me almost everything. 12 years later, that same piece of land has become the most valuable asset in my life. I didn't buy a new car. I didn't change my watch. I didn't move to a luxury hotel. The first thing I did was go to the bank with Richard and set up an irrevocable trust. The sole beneficiary was Elena. Richard read each clause very slowly. Once the assets were transferred to the trust, no one could arbitrarily change the beneficiary. Not even I could withdraw the money at will. I signed every page without hesitation. It was the easiest decision I've ever made. Then I paid off the entire 22% loan that Elena had taken on for me. I asked the bank to transfer the money directly to the finance company so that the debt disappeared that same day. When I received confirmation of the settlement, I finally felt a great sense of relief. That afternoon, I bought Elena a new camera, not the same model as before, a newer model, a better one. But I knew very well that some things couldn't be bought back with money. The first camera was a father's gift to his daughter. The second one was just my way of trying to make up for the sacrifices she never asked for. I still hadn't told Elena about the $25 million. I wanted to wait until everything was finalized. I didn't expect that secret to only last 8 more days. That morning, as Elena was leaving for work, the doorbell rang incessantly. I opened the door. Martha stood on the porch. Victor stood right behind her. Both were impeccably dressed, but their faces lacked their usual composure. Victor held a local newspaper in his hand. The front page featured a picture of the old warehouse and a headline about the biggest sale in the area in years. No one greeted me. No one asked about my well-being. Victor strode straight into the living room as if the apartment were his own. The newspaper was slammed down on the table. Right below it was an article about the previously sealed property, officially changing hands for $25 million. Why didn't you say anything? That was Victor's first question. I pulled up a chair and sat down opposite them. Why should I say anything? Victor frowned. It's family property. I looked directly at my son. For the first time in many years, I no longer felt the pressure to explain to him. Richard had prepared a file for me. I opened the briefcase, took out the property division agreement signed 5 years ago, and placed it on the table. Victor only glanced at the first few lines, his face immediately changing. He flipped through the pages faster. At the last clause, his hand holding the paper froze. In the small room, no one spoke anymore. Martha took the contract from her son's hand and read it again. I saw her lips tighten, her face turning pale. Her signature was still at the bottom of the page, clearly Kalimt, undeniably. Victor slammed the file down on the table. He said the document was unfair, and he would hire a lawyer to sue. I didn't respond immediately. I just took another envelope from my briefcase. Inside was Elena's bank statement before the surgery. I pushed it toward Victor, the final balance, $20. That's all that was left after she withdrew all her savings, sold her beloved camera, and took out a high-interest loan to save my life. Victor looked at the statement for a long time. Martha did too. I then took out the confirmation of the loan being repaid, the receipt for the camera sale, and the hospital bill payment confirmation. Each sheet of paper was placed on the table very slowly. No need to raise your voice, no need to argue. The numbers on the paper said it all. $8,000. I said calmly. That's the money I need to live. I called my wife, I called my son. They both refused. I paused for a few seconds, then placed my hand on the last file. The man with $20 million told me to ask the hospital for installment payments. The man with only $20 in his account sold his future to save me. No one answered. Victor turned his face away. Martha looked down at the floor. It was the first time since they entered the apartment that neither of them could find any excuse to defend themselves. The only sounds in the room were the ticking of the clock and the noise of traffic from the street below. I watched the mother and son for a long time. Then they closed the file. Everything that needed to be said had been said. No one spoke another word for almost a minute. Victor continued to stare at the stack of papers on the table, as if simply staring long enough would make the terms of the agreement disappear. Martha sat motionless, her hands clasped together. I had never seen her so silent for so long, but that silence no longer bothered me. I had spent too many years trying to explain myself. It was time for others to face their own truth. I took one last file from my briefcase. This was the file Richard had prepared specifically for me after the trust had completed all the legal procedures. Each page bore the bank's seal and the signature of the authorized representative. I placed it down in the middle of the table. Victor immediately reached for it. His face changed from the very first page. The trust had been established. All the proceeds from the sale of the land had been transferred into it. The sole beneficiary was Elena. Martha's name was not on it. Victor's name was not on it. There were no clauses allowing for a change of beneficiary in the future. Victor flipped through the pages quickly, stopping at the last one. I saw his fingers clench so tightly that the edges of the paper wrinkled. This time, he couldn't maintain his composure. He said I had acted too emotionally. He believed the money was family property and should be divided equally among the family members. He also mentioned that he was the eldest son, the one who would take care of his mother later, and that my transferring all the assets to Elena was unfair. I let him finish. For the first time in years, I didn't interrupt Victor. I just silently observed. When no one spoke anymore, I opened the brown envelope that had been with me for weeks. Inside were no legal documents. It was the envelope Elena brought to the hospital the day I was waiting for surgery. I kept it as it was. On the front was a small inscription written by Elena in blue ballpoint pen. Dad's deposit. Even when she gave me the whole sum, she didn't write that it was her money. She still called it Dad's money. I set the envelope down next to the bank statement. I kept all of this because I knew I'd need it someday. No one answered. I continued to stare straight at Victor. $25 million isn't a reward for being your father. It's the result of 12 years of living with the same mistake. I lost the printing press. I lost my job. I lost my health. And I almost lost my life. I paused, looking over at Martha. During that time, you two did one thing very clearly. You separated yourselves from my failure. Now you must separate yourselves from its success. Martha bowed her head. I don't know what she's thinking. Maybe regret. Maybe just disappointment that things didn't go as she hoped. But that doesn't matter anymore. I stood up and walked to the window. Down below, Elena had just finished her shift. She was still walking home from the hospital as usual. Her old backpack was still on her shoulder. Her gait was a little slow from a long shift, but each step was steady. She had no idea the conversation was taking place in this apartment, nor did she know her life had changed. I turned back. I've paid off all of Elena's loans. I've bought her a new camera. I've bought a house in her name. I've also set aside money for her to continue her specialist studies and open the private hospital she's always dreamed of. Victor looked at me. For the first time, his eyes no longer held anger. Only helplessness remained. It understood that it was over. There was no legal way to change it. I walked to the apartment door. I think you two should go home. Martha stood up very slowly. She looked around the small room, then at me. There was so much she wanted to say in her eyes, but in the end she just nodded slightly. Victor put the file back on the table. He walked past me without saying another word. The mother and son left the apartment. The door closed softly. There was no arguing, no cursing, only a prolonged silence. I stood alone in the living room. For the first time in years, I no longer felt this room was cramped. About 10 minutes later, Elena opened the door and came in. She smiled as usual, put her backpack down on the chair, and took off her worn-out shoes. The first thing Elena asked was exactly the same as always. Did I take my medication on time today? I laughed, not because the question was unusual, but because I finally understood that what I had lost all these years wasn't money. It felt like being genuinely cared for. I walked over and hugged her. This time, I didn't hide anything anymore. I told Elena about the land, about the $25 million, about the trust, about the new house. She stood still for a long time. Then she shook her head repeatedly, as if she couldn't believe it. I placed the keys to the new house in Elena's hand. You saved my life. Now it's my turn to help you live the life you deserve. Outside on the balcony, the late afternoon sun was casting a pale yellow hue over the city. The old air conditioner in the apartment was still running steadily. On the dining table were a box of heart medication, an old brown envelope, and the family photo I had carried with me for years. I picked up the photo and looked at it for a long time. Then I quietly put it away in the drawer. There are memories worth keeping. But there are also doors that only truly close when we decide not to live in them anymore. That night, for the first time in 12 years, I went to sleep without thinking about debt, illness, or what I had lost, because the next morning, my father and I would begin anew, this time not through suffering, but through freedom.